I never imagined that a routine doctor's visit could rearrange the furniture of my life so thoroughly that every familiar room would feel foreign. For 20 years, I had lived in a house full of easy rhythms. Morning coffee with Lydia, her laugh in the kitchen, the clutter of children's shoes by the back door, the quiet way the light fell across our bed at dusk. I thought those rhythms were truth. I thought the life I had built was honest, if ordinary. I thought love was steady and that the family I had, 3 kids, a mortgage, a dog with a bad temper, was my life center. When the first ache started in my chest, I chalked it up to middle age and bad posture. I work with my hands. I move. I eat whatever is quickest between shifts at the shop. Concerns like infertility or genetic impossibility were about other people with crisper diets and stranger fears. But it was persistent. And so I found myself in a white room with fluorescent lights and an honest doctor who did not bother to give me the small talk I deserved. "It's not good," he said plainly after the test, not raising his eyes from the tablet. "The imaging and the blood markers, there's evidence you've had a long-term hormonal condition. I'm really sorry, but based on what I see, it's highly unlikely you've ever had viable sperm. I'd recommend fertility specialists confirm, but the odds are concerning." He said it like a line in a script, and for a second I thought it was a misread. In the car on the way home, the city blurred around me. The radio talked about some soccer score. The words had weight, but no meaning. My hands gripped the steering wheel as if the leather could anchor me. Lydia called. I let it go to voicemail. Inside the house, everything was normal in the way of families that have existed in the same space for years. There was a cereal box with a hand-drawn dinosaur on the side, our son's homework spread across the table like cast-off confetti, and Lydia humming off-key while she put rice into the cooker. I wanted to tell her everything, that I'd been to the doctor, that maybe there was a simple explanation, that I would be fine. But something in me recoiled. I wanted more than the doctor's speculation. I wanted to be told clearly with evidence. I wanted to be told that the life I'd thought I knew wasn't a lie. I scheduled the follow-up the doctor suggested. The fertility clinic's waiting room felt clinical and small, like a scene staged for grief. They did more tests. Painstaking, intimate, the kind of exams that ask you to volunteer pieces of yourself you never imagined handing over. I told myself to be patient. I read articles that tried to make fertility problems less existential, less like a verdict on manhood, and I tried to believe them, but the test results came back with a precise cruelty. Congenital azoospermia, the complete absence of sperm in the semen. The specialist explained the condition with a surgeon's calm. He mentioned genetics and developmental issues in the womb, offered pastoral advice, and told me, gently, that my body had never been able to produce children. For an hour after the news, the world around me seemed to operate at a different speed. People walked as if their lives were still whole. I lay down in my son's bed and stared at the soccer posters on the walls and thought about the nights I'd rocked a baby and watched the slow climb of a child toward adolescence. I thought of lullabies and scraped knees and birthdays. I asked myself if I had been loving well. I traced the edges of the life I had with the tip of my mind and found, suddenly, that the outline did not hold. That night, when Lydia hugged me and asked about the appointment, I lied. I said everything was fine, that it was nothing serious. Her forehead creased with concern, and she pressed her lips together, a gesture I recognized from 20 years of her disguising stress with practiced calm. After she left the room, I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to think about what to do. Denial was delicious in those moments and anesthetic. If I hadn't asked next, the secret could remain a private tremor. I could go on. I could let the life continue under its old lights. But the seed of doubt had taken root. If my body had never been capable of fathering children, then the certainty of those who call me Dad was fragile. Questions that I had never allowed myself to ask crowded into the space left by the lie. How had she arranged this? When had it started? Why had she hidden it? The intimacy of our life, those private jokes, our shared cigarette after the kids were in bed, the way she reached for my hand in crowds, now felt like an elaborate cover, and the more I thought, the more the house around me seemed to contain actors rather than family. I started, discreetly at first, to look. I am not a man who trusts names on forms. I still keep old receipts in a shoebox and closet. So I checked records, old medical documents we had kept, photos with dates stamped in the corner. The pattern, like a thread in a tapestry, began to appear faintly at first. There were gaps in explanations, long weekends she claimed to be visiting her sister that didn't match phone data, strange receipts from motel rooms far from home, and then the casual mentions of an old friend who would stop by but never be invited in. I told myself I was finding connections in the static of life. I told myself that imagination could conspire with fear to create phantoms. Still, I went to the clinic and asked for DNA testing. I am a craftsman by trade. I've learned patience, the kind required when masonry will not settle until a mortar cures. I wanted incontrovertible proof. Lydia protested when I told her, but she trusted me and the clinic's process and agreed. The kids were too young to understand why blood had to be drawn. They complied, half asleep or bored, trusting us like children always do. When the results came back, the world opened and closed like a fist. The lab called late in the afternoon with a voice that tried on sympathy and failed. The samples were conclusive, the technician said. The tests show no biological relation between you and the children. At first, I did the thing people do when they cannot believe the evidence in front of them. I blamed the lab. I demanded a retest. I arranged for another set of samples. The clinic accommodated me with clinical courtesy and a kind of institutionalized sorrow. The second test agreed with the first. In black and white, my life declared itself to be a lie. Sitting at the kitchen table, the DNA reports fan out like accusation. I watched Lydia move around the room. The way she pressed oil into the pan, the way she bent to tie our son's shoelace, and I felt a cold, clinical understanding take hold. It was not that she had cheated with one man in a moment of weakness. It was a pattern. The children had been fathered by 3 different men at different times. The deception had been elaborate, an architecture of false stories and half-truths. Prayers I had whispered in the dark, promises I had made with my whole being, had been built on scams of the heart. My first reaction was not rage. It was a strange grief, the kind that comes from realizing the basic facts of one's life are wrong. Then the grief gave way to a clean, white-hot anger. I remember standing then, moving without really thinking, and walking to the small office where we kept the file cabinet. I opened it and pulled out photographs, holiday pictures, candid shots from backyard barbecues, and scrutinized faces, eyes, jawlines, as if I could find in the grain of a photograph the moment the truth had been slipped past me. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the porch with a cigarette that tasted like ash and thought about the man I had been, trusting, uncomplicated, proud of being a provider. I thought about our children, who had crawled into my lap with milk on their mouths, who had called me dad with full-throated affection. I thought about loyalty, how I had given mine unquestioningly, and then about the nature of punishment and whether there could be justice that felt commensurate with the magnitude of this betrayal. Vengeance is a dangerous word. In the dark, it took on a clarity that was almost mathematical. If she had built a life on lies, perhaps the only rectification was to remove from her the scaffolding she had used, her financial footholds, her status, her comfort. It would be clean, I decided, not violent, not cruel in the way that breaks bodies, but calculated, precise, lawful, the kind of revenge that left her with nothing, while leaving me morally intact enough to live in the aftermath. In the morning, I told myself I would sleep on it. I lied again and went to bed thinking like an architect planning demolition. Revenge requires a draft and then patient execution. It requires you to see the way the world works in small mechanics. Bank records, legal documents, public registries, signatures, and the assumptions people make about marital trust. In those weeks after the diagnosis, I became a student of the everyday things people rely on without thought. I learned the sound of the locks that led to safety, the cadence of Lydia's lies, the places where she had trusted sloppiness to cover deceit. My first step was to compartmentalize. I could not afford an emotional collapse. The children were children. They needed a father who could still be present, at least on the surface. I could not act like a man blinded by rage who storms into the street and does something irreversible. I am not the sort of man who burns bridges without knowing the crossing. My revenge would be surgical and tactical. I started with money. Lydia was the more socially savvy of the two of us. She had always managed the household accounts, handled the school subscriptions, and somehow kept a social circle that made us look better than we were. Our house, on paper, was jointly owned, and the business, my small repair shop, was in my name. But we had many joint accounts, and Lydia had access to a little fortune she had kept tucked away. A list of small direct deposits. Cash moved between accounts with an ease that only someone used to sliding money could manage. I sat with our bank statements like a detective, tracing the line of deposits, the small withdrawals, the pattern of gift cards and flights. She had, over time, built a private ledger. If there was one place where she had been sloppy, it was on paperwork. She had relied on charm and the assumption that I would never read the fine print. I began collecting evidence, not to confront her in the raw. Confrontation is often the moment where people get smart and cover their tracks, but to create a file that could stand up in court. I made copies of receipts, bank statements, and past signatures. Every small irregularity was a brick in a wall I was building. There was also the matter of custody and the house. The law in our jurisdiction is not cruel to people who have been married long-term. Division of assets tends to aim for fairness. I contacted a lawyer who specialized in matrimonial law and spoke hypothetically at first, watching for reactions. The lawyer's eyes had the calculating calm that comes with knowing how human relationships break down into paperwork. You can make a claim, he said, but if you aim to leave her with nothing, you need to show fault. Fraud, concealment of assets, that sort of thing. His voice was encouraging in that way legal professionals are when they see a case with teeth. Fault. That was the magic word. If I could demonstrate that Lydia had intentionally deceived me about critical facts, about parentage, about incomes, about property, then I could argue for an equitable but punitive settlement. The law can be a lever. It is slow, clumsy, and maddeningly patient, but it can be used. I widened my net. I learned how to access property records, how to comb through the family's tax returns for irregularities, how to subpoena bank records without appearing vindictive. I kept my face placid, my home life outwardly normal. I attended my children's school events, took them to football practice, and fixed the sink leaks. At night, when they slept, I worked the case. I hired a private investigator, someone with the kind of moral grayness to watch people like Lydia move through the world, and I paid him with cash I'd hidden at the back of my tool chest. He found the edges I had suspected and some things I had not. Lydia had been careful with one pattern that proved she was both cautious and bold. She had relationships that produced child support arrangements or discrete paternity agreements from the men she'd been involved with. In at least one case, she had a written agreement where a man was listed as the father on a birth registration, but then relinquished rights. In another, cash payments had been made with the explicit understanding that the man would not be involved. These were documents she had thought to shield, agreements made in panic and secrecy over the years. She had been industrious in creating distance between truth and consequence. The investigator produced emails, texts, and in a few cases, bank transfers that trace motel rooms and airport taxis on nights. She claimed to be at home with me. I remember the first time I saw her face when I held a photocopy of a motel receipt with her name on it. It happened far later in the process, but the memory of her expression, small, suddenly childlike and panicked, has stayed with me like photograph. At that moment, what I felt was not triumph, but a dislocated pity. She had perfected a lie with such care she had forgotten to plan for the day it would be discovered. Or perhaps she had planned, assuming she could live with the deception indefinitely. The private investigator also found something that would later prove decisive. Evidence of Lydia moving money into accounts under other names. Small transfers over years, designed to look like purchases or savings. She had been building a nest with funds that might have covered legal costs, a down payment on freedom, or even another start. The pattern was there if you knew how to read it. Purchases made in foreign cities, airline tickets booked for single seats to places where a new life could begin. It was reckless and arrogant to think you can hide a trail forever. Armed with documentation, I approached the lawyer in a series of quiet visits. He laid out the options. There were measures to freeze accounts, to petition for discovery, to challenge the joint titling of our house. He advised caution. If I moved too quickly, I could alert her to clean up, to move assets into places opaque to legal inspection. He recommended a discreet, phase approach. We filed motions that would quietly require her to disclose financials, and we subpoenaed the bank records the investigator had discovered. All the while, I kept my face steady in the house, attended school plays, and pretended that my world remained intact. I cultivated allies, people who knew Lydia's social life, neighbors who had noticed her late-night comings and goings, the bartender who'd given her a discount when she paid cash. In a small town, gossip grows like ivy. It can be cruel, but also produces threads that can be tugged. The legal filings did their quiet work behind sealed doors. The court's response was bureaucratic but effective. Accounts were temporarily frozen, and Lydia was notified that her financial disclosure had to be full and complete or risk contempt. She protested, of course. She cried, but she hadn't planned for this. She had lived on the assumption that the truth would remain divisible, a silent thing buried under 20 years of domestic life. In public, I remained calm. In private, I restructured my life to be less dependent on a house that had become a symbol of my shame. I opened accounts in my own name, transferred assets away from the shared accounts in ways the law allowed, and documented every cent I moved. I am not ashamed to say I saw the world like a ledger in those months. Every kindness she had shown me did not erase the lie. Every laugh became an entry to be reviewed. The day the court froze from the joint accounts, I felt a strange, vindicated relief. Lydia accused me of betrayal. She screamed in the kitchen, called me a monster, and accused me of conspiring with those men to ruin her. She blamed the men whose names were on paternity documents and demanded protection. The kids, who were old enough to understand partial truths, clung to her and cried for the father they loved. I held their phone calls when they reached for me, answered them with a voice I practiced until it sounded like me and not a man pulled apart by scandal. A quiet cruelty that I had not intended crept into me. I found that as the law's machinery did its work, Lydia's options narrowed. Her bank cards were temporarily blocked, and suddenly the small luxuries she had taken for granted, the ability to send international money transfers, the late-night flights, were gone. It was never my intent to humiliate our children. I wanted the scaffolding removed from her life, so she would have to face the consequences of the architecture of deceit she had built. The law did its slow, impartial work, and I let it. There were nights in those months when I dreamed of the past and saw it altered by a single line of text, not biologically related. I walked the neighborhood and watched people in their windows. I smelled dinner and felt detached as if from some play whose lines I had been reciting for years. Lydia's protest simmered into bargaining. She came to the lawyer with suggestions of mediation. She offered to sign affidavits of the children's paternity being irrelevant, to sign away claims for assets if I promised to remain in the house. I listened to her pleas as if they were the pleas of a stranger asking for mercy from a tribunal. Mercy was not something I was prepared to grant, not after what I had been given in place of truth. When the settlement talks began, I was deliberate. I asked for full disclosure. I demanded records of all accounts and the names connected to them. I insisted on a forensic accountant's review. Her face, when the auditor reported irregularities, was one of the few times I saw untempered fear. She wept and said she had been protecting us, that the men had promised to help and then vanished, that she had done what she had to provide. She said words meant to humanize a monster. The court does not base judgments on humanizing statements alone. It wants facts. The final pieces of the plan were small but crucial. I proposed a settlement that would grant her a modest spousal support for a limited time, but condition it on full disclosure, evidence of good faith, and the forfeiture of any claims to business I had built. I insisted that the children's legal guardianship be clarified and for their welfare to be used as a standard for visitation schedules. I wanted to ensure that if she attempted to start again on the backs of the family wealth, she would be constrained. In her corner, she argued, cried, and promised. In mine, I presented evidence and contracts. The judge listened as if hearing a long, ugly human tale for the first time. The judge's ruling was cautious but decisive. Because Lydia had concealed assets and had been less than forthcoming about her finances, she was denied the full array of settlement benefits she might have otherwise claimed. She would receive a limited, time-cap support in the house, owned in our names, would be sold and its proceeds distributed, With my portion protected by documentable improvements and hidden investments I proved were mine, the business stayed with me. The frozen accounts were unblocked only in limited measure, with requirements for transparency. It was not absolute victory. The court rarely renders such, but it was enough to change the trajectory of her life. It was enough to leave her with little of the nest she had tried to build. The last day the lawyer called to tell me the final settlement had been signed was one of those late, pale afternoons when the sky looked like old paper. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug gone cold and thought about the small ordinariness of it all. The stack of mail, the dirty plate I had not gotten around to washing, the dog that paced like he'd always been thrown to the same routines. Lydia sat across from me, hair unbrushed, her eyes rimmed with red. The house had become a courtroom of memories. "How can you do this?" she asked, voice small and exhausted. "We were married. We built things. The kids." "The kids are the kids," I said, because I wanted to remind her of something she'd forgotten in her fury. The children were not instruments. I will always take care of them. But you build a life by lying about the most fundamental thing a family can be. I cannot pretend otherwise. Her reply was a string of accusations: manipulation, cruelty, betrayal of trust. She argued about love and survival, and the choices a woman makes when there is little else to rely upon. She asked me, with a rawness that shocked me, how she would survive. I had arranged that the limited spousal support, the school payments, the stipulations for the children's welfare. It was a hard municipal kindness. It would not be comfortable, but it would be a stern illumination of consequence. People ask me now if I felt triumphant when I walked out of the house, if I felt a lightness like the man who has achieved the fruit of revenge. I did not. I felt, oddly, like a person who had cleared away a rotten beam from a house that remained standing. There was freedom in not having to lie over me anymore, yes. But there was also a profound sorrow for the years spent in a deception that had been both elaborate and intimate. I had loved a woman, and she had loved the life she could get from deception. Love had been rerouted through secrecy, and its detours had taken decades. Leaving the house felt like packing up a set of props after a long play. I took what was mine, arranged the sale, and found somewhere smaller to live. I kept custody arrangements sane and fair, not for revenge, but because the children had done nothing wrong. We agreed on a schedule where I would be present in their lives. They came to stay with me some weekends. We cooked. We argued about homework. We laughed at the same terrible jokes. The distance between dad and biological father was a concept too abstract for their small hearts. I tried to be the steady presence they had always known. Lydia moved out with a bag and a small set of clothes. The man who had been an intermittent presence in her life, one of the three fathers, appeared in the margins for a while, offering help and then quietly disappearing like a draft. She took a small apartment and started to earn her keep in ways she had not needed before. The network of covert support she constructed evaporated when the law and the community turned its light on to them. People who had thought her sympathetic whispered, and some who had been close went away. She had assumed ties were supple. They were brittle. There is an ugly human hunger to see consequences enacted in real time. Friends asked me later if I regretted the decisions I had made, if I had been too harsh to leave her with so little. I have thought about that more than I can say. There are nights when the weight of what we did, the legal maneuvers, the public humiliation, the way the children looked at their mother, sits like gravel in my throat. The moral calculus is not clean. I did what I thought would set me right, but rightness is not the same as peace. After the settlement, my life became a quieter thing. I rebuilt the repair shop, hired a young man to apprentice, and spent evenings teaching him the small rituals of a craft I loved. I took the kids to the river and taught them how to skip stones. We planted a small orchard in the new backyard, a ridiculous, stubborn thing to do when you've been felled by life's crazy weather. In the spring, the trees leafed out, and we ate fruit off our labor. It felt like a promise. It felt like the smallest possible act of hope. People in town took sides in the way small towns do. Some called me a martyr. Some said I overreacted. But the most surprising reaction came from an old neighbor who found me one afternoon fixing the fence. She handed me a wrapped loaf of bread and said, quietly, "Good for you?" Her words were less about vindication than about the human preference for truth over comfortable delusions. Truth, even when brutal, felt more honest. My children grew. They had always been my children the way that matters most. Through shared meals, through bandaged knees and late-night whispered confessions. Biological threads are a fact. They are not the only fabric that makes a family. Yet the discovery of those facts had forced every adult around them to reckon with the limits of trust. I tried to hold that reckoning with humility and without asserting myself as judge and executioner. I had sought reparation. I did not seek to ruin the children's sense of home. Lydia called me once, months after the split, voice low and cracked. She wanted to apologize, not for the facts she had kept, but for the indulgence of her choices, for the way she had confused survival with deception. The apology came with a plea for a little more support and the recognition that she had no one else to turn to. I listened as someone listening to the confession of a person who had, finally, run out of ways to justify herself. I offered practical help in ways the settlement required me to, and I did what any responsible parent does. I kept the door open in modest ways for the sake of the children. When friends asked if I would do the same again, take my life apart to prove a point, I answered honestly, I would have wished for a different path. I would have preferred honesty early, even if painful, to the stretching of weeks into decades. But once the facts were there, the only honest response was to correct the balance. I would not, in good conscience, have allowed a life of lies to stand unchallenged. Sometimes, late at night, I think about Lydia in her small apartment. I imagine her walking the streets of a life stripped to essentials, bargaining with a world she had not thought to plan for honestly. I feel for her, and I do not forgive her. Forgiveness is not a neat transaction you can grant and then file away. It is, if it is real, slow and foundational. I do not know if I will forgive her. Maybe forgiveness is for the children, for the future that might be cleaner for them because the lie is gone. In the end, the revenge I enacted was a settling of accounts more than an act of annihilation. I left her with little, not because I took pleasure in her poverty, but because I could not allow the life she constructed on deception to continue. I wanted a world where truth mattered enough to carry consequences. I wanted, selfishly perhaps, to unburden myself from the constant cognitive dissonance of loving a life that was half fabrication. Life mercifully goes on. The orchard is bearing fruit. The repair shop hums. The kids laugh at the stupid jokes I tell badly. They still call me Dad, and my hands are still their steady things. I have rebuilt in quiet ways, not with the vindictive joy of a man who has won, but with the weary, difficult peace of someone who has had to learn that the scaffolding of life can sometimes be the lie itself, and that sometimes the only humane action left is to bring that scaffolding down so a truer structure can someday be built.